Hey guys, tonight we're venturing into the shadows of the quiet, moss-covered garden. A place of healing, yes, but also a place of secrets, whispers, and plants that could blur the line between sleep and death. We're diving into the world of the forbidden sleep herbs of the Renaissance. Forget the romantic paintings and enlightened scholars for a moment. The truth is, the Renaissance was a time when medicine, magic, and murder all grew from the same soil. So, before you get too comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments what your favorite magical plant is, real or fictional. Now, maybe lower the lights. Forget the fan. Tonight, we need silence. Because we're about to unlock the apothecaries' secret cabinet. Let's ease into tonight's journey together. Congratulations, you're an apprentice in a 16th century apothecary. And no, this isn't some charming sun-drenched shop with neatly labeled bottles and the gentle scent of potpourri. This is Florence, 1532. The air inside your shop, well, it's a whole other universe of smells. It's a symphony of decay and preservation, a place where life and death are ground together with a mortar and pestle. The first thing that hits you when you wake is the cold. Not a crisp, clean cold, but a damp, penetrating chill that seems to rise from the very flagstones of the floor. You sleep on a thin straw pallet in the tiny, windowless room behind the main shop, a space you share with sacks of dried herbs, hanging bundles of what you hope are roots and not mummified animals. Your blanket is coarse wool, a threadbare hand-me-down that smells permanently of dust, mildew, and the faint, bitter aroma of the yarrow that was spilled on it 3 months ago. You don't wash it. You don't wash yourself much either. The same river that carries away the city's waste is the same river people draw from. Better to be grimy and alive than clean and dead from the flux. The city outside is just beginning to stir, a low rumble that you feel more than hear. The first clang of the church bell from Santa Maria Novella is your true alarm clock. A bronze hammer strike against the sky that tells you your master, Valerius, will be here within the hour. You scramble to your feet, the cold floor a shock to your bare soles. Your task, before he arrives, is always the same, to make the shop presentable, which is a fool's errand. You sweep the floor, but all you're really doing is rearranging the dirt and spilled powders from the day before. You wipe down the heavy oak counter, not with a clean cloth, but with a slightly less dirty one, leaving streaks in the accumulated grime. You check the leeches in their murky jar, prodding the sluggish, slimy bodies to make sure enough are alive for the day's bloodlettings. One has died, a shriveled black husk at the bottom. You fish it out with a wooden stick and toss it into the small hearth, where it sizzles for a moment before turning to ash. Waste not, want not. The only light comes from a single, grimy, leaded glass window facing the narrow street. It doesn't let in sunlight, it lets in a weak, grey approximation of it, just enough to illuminate the dust motes dancing in the air like tiny, frantic spirits. The walls are lined from floor to ceiling with wooden shelves, crammed with hundreds of ceramic jars, glass vials, and wooden boxes. Each one has a handwritten label in your master's spidery Latin script: Valeriana, Salvia, Belladonna, Mandragora. Some names you recognize. Others, you've been warned never to touch. They are the province of the master, the dangerous knowledge he keeps locked away, not just in boxes, but behind his cold, calculating eyes. There's the sharp, metallic tang of ground bloodstone, used for staunching wounds. the cloying sweetness of dried poppy heads, a scent that seems to promise a beautiful, terrifying oblivion. The dusty ghost of chamomile, the earthy funk of valerian root, and the acrid chemical bite of sulfur and mercury, the tools of the alchemist's trade. Master Valerius arrives precisely as the church bell strikes its sixth chime. He doesn't knock. The heavy wooden door simply creaks open, and he enters like a shadow detaching itself from the wall. He is a man who seems to be made of the same materials as his shop, dry, brittle, and steeped in secrets. His back is stooped from decades of leaning over grinding stones and simmering alembics. His hands are permanently stained, the yellow of saffron, the deep brown of walnut husks, the faint rusty red of dried dragon's blood resin, or so you tell yourself. His eyes, though, are sharp. They miss nothing. They sweep across the shop, noting the freshly swept floor, the position of every jar, the level of wine in the infusion bottles. He gives a curt, non-committal grunt, which you have learned is the highest form of praise you will ever receive. Your day begins with the mundane. Your first task is grinding. He hands you a chunk of lapis lazuli, a stone the color of a twilight sky. It's not for medicine, but for paint. A nearby artist, a protege of some great master, pays handsomely for the purest ultramarine pigment. A healer, yes, but also a businessman. If a painter's vanity pays better than a peasant's colic, then today you are a colour maker. You sit at the heavy stone grinding table, the slab of porphyry worn smooth and concave from centuries of use. You place the stone in the centre and begin to crush it with a heavy pestle. It's back-breaking work. The rhythmic thump-scrape of the stone is the heartbeat of your morning. Your shoulders ache, your hands are raw. The fine blue dust gets into your clothes, your hair, under your fingernails. You look like you've been wrestling with an angel. All the while, Valerius watches, instructing you. Slower. The heat from the friction will dull the color. You are merely its guide. He speaks in clipped, precise tones, as if words are a finite resource he is reluctant to spend. As the morning wears on, customers begin to trickle in. They are a cross-section of Florentine life, united by their pain, their fear, and their hope that Master Valerius can sell them a miracle in a bottle. A servant girl comes first, her face pale with worry. Her mistress, a wealthy merchant's wife, is suffering from melancholia, a deep, unshakable sadness. She cannot eat, cannot sleep. Valerius listens, his face impassive. He doesn't ask about her life, her husband, her home. He asks about her humours. Is her blood thick when she is bled? He diagnoses an excess of black bile, the humour of earth, cold and dry, which governs the spleen and produces melancholy. The cure? A concoction to purge the excess. He measures out a powder of borage and fennel, adds a pinch of something you don't recognise, and mixes it with honey to form a thick, dark paste. A spoonful with watered wine every morning before she breaks her fast, he instructs the girl. And tell your mistress to avoid dark meats, aged cheese, and sorrowful thoughts. The girl pays with a few small coins and scurries away, clutching the small ceramic pot as if it were the Holy Grail. You know the truth. The borage might lift her spirits slightly, but the real cure, if there is one, lies in the woman's belief that it will work. Much of what Valerius sells is not medicine, but hope. The next customer is different. A man with a hooded cloak and shifty eyes who pulls Valerius into a shadowed corner. He whispers. You can't hear the words, but you see the glint of gold coins in his palm. Valerius's face remains a mask. He nods slowly, then turns and walks to the back of the shop. He doesn't go to the main shelves. He goes to a heavy, iron-strapped chest that sits in the darkest corner, a chest you have been forbidden to approach. He unlocks it with a key he wears on a leather cord around his neck, a key that never leaves his body, not even when he sleeps. The chest opens with a low groan. You can't see what he retrieves, but when he returns to the man, he passes him a small, unmarked vial filled with a clear, oily liquid. More gold is exchanged. The man melts back into the street, and Valerius locks the chest, his movements deliberate and final. His gaze is as sharp and cold as a shard of glass. "Attend to the fire," he says, his voice flat, dismissing you and the question you wouldn't dare to ask. You know what was requested. It wasn't a cure. It was a solution. A quiet, untraceable solution to a problem, likely one with a heartbeat. The apothecary's trade is not always about healing. Sometimes it's about expediting the inevitable. Lunch is a hunk of coarse bread and a wedge of hard cheese, eaten while standing at your workbench. There is no break, no moment of rest. While you eat, you are tasked with preparing a poultice. A bricklayer fell from a scaffold, and his leg is a swollen, purple mass of bruised flesh. Valerius directs you to mash comfrey root, known as knitbone, for its supposed ability to heal fractures with lard and wine. The smell is earthy and sour. As you work the thick paste with your hands, you can't help but think of the man in the cloak. The same hands that are now preparing a remedy to mend a broken body could just as easily be grinding a poison to stop a beating heart. The line between the two is terrifyingly thin, and it seems to be drawn by nothing more than the weight of the coins offered. In the mid-afternoon, a lull descends upon the shop. The street outside grows quieter as the city retreats for its midday repose. Master Valerius, after a long morning of consultations, announces he is going to the university to consult a text on the distillation of antimony. "You will remain," he says. "It is not a request. Grind the rest of the lapis. Decant the rosewater infusion. Do not touch anything else. And do not admit anyone unless their need is dire. A severed limb or a plague boil, perhaps, nothing less." The silence in the shop is a living thing. It's broken only by the buzz of a fly trapped against the window pane and the faint, rhythmic drip of a condenser in the back room. The air feels heavy with unspoken words, with the ghosts of all the pain and hope that have passed through these walls. Your eyes are drawn, inevitably, to the corner, to the iron-strapped chest, the source of your master's true power and your deepest curiosity. You know you shouldn't. His warning was clear, but the temptation is a physical thing, an itch under your skin. This is the heart of the apothecary's art, the knowledge that separates a mere apprentice from a master. It is the art of life and, more importantly, of death. You abandon the grinding stone, your heart hammering against your ribs. You move across the floor, your footsteps seeming impossibly loud in the silence. You kneel before the chest. It's made of dark, heavy wood, bound with black iron. The lock is intricate, a complex piece of metalwork that seems to mock your simple curiosity. But as you run your fingers over it, you notice something. A tiny, almost invisible scratch near the keyhole. It seems Master Valerius, in his haste, did not fully engage the lock. Your breath catches. With trembling fingers, you pull at the heavy lid. It resists for a moment, and then, with a deep, shuddering groan that sounds like a man drawing his last breath, it opens. The smell that rises from the chest is nothing like the rest of the shop. It is not the smell of healing or preservation. It is the smell of power. It's heavy, earthy, and sweet, with a strange metallic undertone that makes the hairs on your arms stand up. There's a lead-lined box, heavy and cold to the touch. A small, intricately carved wooden case that seems to absorb the light around it. A collection of deep blue and black glass vials, stoppered with wax and sealed with your master's personal signet. This is his secret garden, the collection of forbidden knowledge. These are the sleep herbs, the ones that don't just help you rest, they can unmoor your soul from your body. They aren't forbidden by some grand royal decree from the Medici Duke. They're forbidden by common sense, by the church who sees the devil's handiwork in every strangely shaped root, and by the simple, terrifying fact that one extra pinch, one careless measurement, is the difference between a gentle slumber and an eternal silent one. A boy who sweeps floors and grinds stones. But as you stare into that open chest, you understand that you are kneeling at the altar of life and death. The knowledge inside is a key, a weapon, a poison, and a cure, all at once. And now that you have seen it, you can never go back to being the boy who simply followed orders. You have glimpsed the apothecaries' gamble, and it has changed you forever. You hear the jingle of the bell above the door. You slam the heavy lid shut, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the silent shop, just as the shadow of your returning master falls across the floor. You leap to your feet, your heart a trapped bird in your chest, and pray to a God you're not sure is listening, that he didn't hear the groan of the forbidden chest or the sound of your own innocence breaking. The heavy wooden door closed behind Valerius, and the iron-strapped chest groaned a final, dying syllable as it settled back into its corner. You stayed kneeling, hands braced on the dusty floorboards, heart pounding against your ribs with the panicked rhythm of a trapped bird. The silence that followed was not empty. It was pressurized, filled with the sheer force of your master's cold, assessing gaze. Valerius did not speak. He did not accuse. He simply stood there, cloaked in the gloom of the shop. His eyes, the color of wet slate, swept over your trembling form, lingering for a fraction of a second on the dust clinging to the knees of your coarse tunic. Dust that might have just come from the grinding table, or dust that might have just come from the forbidden velvet lining of the open chest. He seemed to be listening, not with his ears but with his entire body, searching for the echo of the chest's hasty closure, searching for the telltale scent of secrets disturbed. Finally he spoke, his voice dry and flat, utterly devoid of emotion. You waste the pigment. It was a reprimand, not an accusation. He was letting you know he had observed the lapse, the distraction, but he was choosing to focus on the immediate, tangible failure, the improperly ground stone. He did not rage. He simply reminded you that your life and your continued employment depended on absolute precision. You rose quickly, bowing your head, mumbling an apology that felt thick and useless in your throat. He walked past you, the faint, metallic scent of mercury clinging to his robes, and proceeded to the iron chest. He unlocked it again, slowly, deliberately, giving the key 3 full, grinding turns, ensuring the apprentice's mind registered the finality of the sound. This time, he didn't care if you watched. In fact, he wanted you to. He reached inside and pulled forth not the small, anonymous vials you had glimpsed, but a heavy wooden crate, rough-hewn and bound with tarnished bronze wire. It smelled intensely earthy, like freshly turned soil, and something sharp, almost spicy, with a sickeningly sweet undertone that seemed to tickle the back of your throat. "We have a commission from the Guild of Barbers and Surgeons," Valerius announced, his tone purely professional. "The winter operations are set to begin. They require a fresh batch of soporific infusion. The principal component is here." He placed the crate onto the main workbench. Inside, nestled in a bed of drying moss and darkened straw, were several specimens of mandrake root. You had read about it, heard the whispered stories in the dark corners of the market square, seen the crude woodcuts in forbidden herbal guides. But to see it, to breathe the air around it, was different. It was perhaps the most famous, most feared, and most highly prized botanical in all of Christendom. The roots were large, heavy, and pale. But what gave them their terrifying fame was their structure. They were forked, bulbous, and oddly articulated, twisting and branching into shapes that eerily mimicked the human form. Some looked like infants curled in sleep, others like squatting demons, and one, in particular, looked exactly like a small, nude man, arms and legs outstretched, mouth gaping in a silent, permanent scream. It was grotesque and fascinating, a botanical monstrosity that seemed to pulsate with a dark, primordial energy. Valerius reached in, his fingers gloved in soft leather, handling the root not with reverence but with a cautious, practiced contempt. "This particular specimen," he said, holding up the most human-shaped piece, "was sourced from the mountains outside Bologna. The soil there is rich in iron, and the local folklore is rich in idiocy." He was, of course, referring to the legend. The pervasive, terrifying story that mandrake would shriek upon being pulled from the earth, and that the sound was so potent, so deeply tied to the forces of the underworld, that it would instantly kill any mortal who heard it. The common peasant believed this implicitly. You knew the sophisticated academic explanation from Valerius. The shriek was likely the sound of the thick root tearing from the soil as a cord snapped, and the poisonous fumes released upon digging could cause confusion, disorientation, or collapse, which the terrified peasants interpreted as a fatal auditory attack. But Valerius was still pragmatic enough to respect the folklore. You had observed him months ago on a procuring trip, standing at the edge of a field while a peasant, eyes tightly bandaged, used a long rope tied from the root to a starved, terrified dog. The dog was driven forward, the rope snapped, the root flew out, and the dog collapsed, writhing in silent agony before death claimed it, its sacrifice ensuring the root was harvested without risk to the master. Valerius simply paid the peasant, collected the root, and muttered something about necessary foolishness. Now you had to handle it. Your task was to prepare the root for infusion. It had to be washed, scraped clean of soil, and then minced finely. A process that must be done quickly and with minimal exposure to the potent, volatile oils. Valerius provided the tools, a basin of clean, cool river water, pre-boiled, for Valerius did not gamble with his own life, a fine silver scalpel, and a deep marble mortar reserved only for the most powerful alkaloidal plants. "Observe the cuts," Valerius instructed, his voice now a low, intense hum. "The sap is the most potent. Do not let it contact your skin. The absorption is rapid. Focus. You are merely preparing it for the flame, nothing more." You began, the metallic scent of the mandrake filling your nostrils, causing a faint buzzing sensation behind your eyes. The root was firm, almost fleshy, but beneath the surface it resisted the scalpel, forcing you to use deliberate, precise pressure. You scraped away the thin, pale skin, which fell away in moist curls. Beneath was the true flesh, the color of oxidized ivory, bleeding a thin, milky sap that instantly turned brown upon contact with the air. You worked slowly, your breath held, focusing only on the silver blade, the pale root, and the deep, dark basin of water waiting to receive the scrapings. The mental pressure was immense. Every touch, every movement felt weighted with potential catastrophe. You were holding concentrated, centuries-old poison. You remembered the uses of mandrake, the terrible, necessary power it wielded in this cruel age. It was the great Renaissance anesthetic. The barber surgeons who practiced their trade often in grimy alleys or crowded, noisy operating theatres had only two tools against agonizing pain: speed and mandrake. Before an amputation, a leg crushed by a wagon, a hand rotted by infection, the surgeon would administer the soporific wine. The liquid had to be exact, too weak, and the patient would wake up screaming and thrashing as the sore ripped through bone, often leading to a fatal shock. Too strong, and the patient would simply slip into the death that awaited them anyway, but prematurely. It was a perfect microcosm of Renaissance medicine, a dangerous solution to an impossible problem, based entirely on the apothecary's best, desperate guess. You scraped, your hands growing slick with cold sweat beneath the gloves. You could feel the slight tremors beginning in your fingertips, a combination of fatigue and fear. The psychological effect of the mandrake was immediate. It felt like handling a dormant spirit, something volatile and angry waiting to be unleashed. Mandrake was central to the unguentum sabbati, the Sabbath ointment, the magical compound witches were accused of rubbing onto their bodies to attend their unholy midnight meetings. The ointment was said to contain mandrake, henbane, belladonna, and children's fat, all powerful poisons and psychoactive agents. You were preparing a pharmaceutical remedy, but you knew that in the hands of others, this very powder could be used to summon visions, or worse, to induce the false death that was often used in political intrigue or forbidden romances, where a person needed to appear dead for 3 days before awakening to a new life, or perhaps not awakening at all. You completed the scraping, the final piece of the root placed into the marble mortar. Valerius, who had been silently preparing vials of rose oil nearby, watched your work with an air of detached scrutiny. The contact with the iron of the mortar must be brief. We want a coarse powder, not a fine dust. The friction releases the heat, and the heat degrades the atropine and scopolamine. The marble mortar was deep, and the sound of the mandrake being crushed was a solid, muffled thud, 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 a sound that seemed terribly final. The aroma intensified, the sweetness now overpowering the earthiness, making your head feel heavy and slightly lightheaded. You ground quickly, your biceps burning, determined to finish the task perfectly. You focused on the powder, a pale grey-white, flecked with the minute dark spots of the volatile oils. As you worked, the vast moral landscape of the mandrake's power unfolded in your mind. This was the true forbidden nature. It wasn't just poison, it was control. Control over consciousness. The power to induce sleep was the power to steal time, to suspend life, to cheat the agony of the surgeon's saw. But the precise same knowledge allowed you to create the aqua tofana, the slow-acting poison that could be slipped into a nobleman's wine, simulating natural decline and death. The difference was infinitesimal, measured in grains of powder, but the intent was cosmic. You thought of the patient waiting for the operation. His life, his suffering, his very consciousness rested in the dosage you were now preparing. The responsibility was crushing. You were not just a grinder of herbs, you were the steward of life's most fragile boundary. You finished the grinding, the powder now a uniform, grainy heap at the bottom of the mortar. You used a silver scoop to transfer it into a dark glass infusion jar. Valerius approached, inspected the grain size with a meticulous eye, and nodded. A rare acknowledgement of a job done well. He took the jar, added wine and a measure of opium extract, the poppy's contribution to the sleeping draught, and sealed it with a wax stopper. As the chest groaned shut, and the 3 heavy turns of the key locked away the man-root, you felt a wave of dizzying relief. You had handled the mandrake, stared into the face of a screaming root, and survived. You were physically intact, but mentally something had shifted. You had moved beyond theory and folklore. You now possessed a dark, intimate knowledge of the power held by the plant. The cold sweat clinging to your tunic felt like a badge. Valerius returned to his counter, his face impassive. Clean the mortar. We do not wish for unintended consequences. You set about the final task, scrubbing the heavy marble clean, the sour vinegar cutting through the heavy, sickly sweet aroma of the mandrake. The buzzing behind your eyes subsided, replaced by a lingering exhaustion. You had survived your first encounter with the heart of the prohibited pharmacopoeia. But the thought remained. Mandrake was merely the beginning. What dark journeys waited in the seeds of henbane, the next drawer your master might command you to open? You were now privy to the deepest secrets of the Renaissance apothecary, and that knowledge was heavier than any grinding stone. It was a weight you would carry forever. The silent, cold power of the scream was now part of you. The vinegar's sharp scent finally scoured the last ghostly sweetness of the mandrake from the marble mortar, but the memory of its power clung to the air, a silent, invisible stain. You finished your task, your movements slow and deliberate, a profound exhaustion settling deep into your bones. It was more than the physical labor of grinding or the tension of handling the screaming root. It was a weariness of the soul. You had touched one of the great secrets, and the knowledge felt like a physical weight on your shoulders. You assumed your day of trials was over, that you would return to the mundane tasks of mixing salves and bundling herbs. You were wrong. The lesson had only just begun. Valerius, who had been observing you from across the shop with an unnerving stillness, did not instruct you to return to the lapis lazuli. Instead, he gestured with a long, stained finger toward the iron-strapped chest. "The guild's order is not yet complete," he stated, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate in the heavy air. "The soporific for the surgeons is a crude instrument for a crude purpose, a bludgeon to render the senses inert. But there are other sleeps, other dreams. The mind is a labyrinth, boy, and there are maladies that cannot be cut out with a knife or purged with a laxative. There are afflictions of the spirit." He bypassed the lead-lined box of the mandrake and reached deeper, retrieving a small, flat case made of dark, polished yew wood. This was a foul, sickly scent, like damp wool and rotting vegetation, with a sharp, acrid note that made you want to recoil. Inside, resting on a bed of faded silk, were several dried stalks of a plant. The leaves were hairy and sticky to the touch, and at the top of each stalk was a cluster of bizarre, urn-shaped pods, each one crowned with a small, star-like cap. The word itself felt cursed. This was not a plant of healing, not in the way that chamomile or willow bark were. This was a plant of whispers, of madness, of the darkest corners of folklore. This was the witch's herb. The primary ingredient, you knew from hushed rumors and forbidden texts, in the unguentum sabati, the flying ointment. The very name sent a chill down your spine, a cold dread that had nothing to do with the damp air of the shop. To be associated with this plant, To even know of its uses was to court the attention of the Holy Office. The Inquisition did not deal in nuance. To them, knowledge of henbane was proof of witchcraft, and the punishment was absolute. The mind, Valerius continued, seemingly oblivious to your internal panic, can become a prison. A man can be haunted by spirits, by grief, by a melancholy so profound that he sees demons in every shadow. The physicians will bleed him, the priests will pray over him, but the torment remains. In such cases, a different kind of sleep is required. Not the sleep of oblivion, but a sleep of journeys. A guided dream. They contain the power to unmoor the soul from the body, to allow the mind to wander through landscapes of its own making. It is a dangerous passage. The traveller may encounter his demons and vanquish them, or he may become lost in the wilderness of his own madness forever. Your task, he explained, was to separate the seeds from the pods. The work required patience and a delicate touch. The seeds were tiny, smaller than a grain of sand, and coated in a sticky, toxic residue. You were given a small bronze bowl, a pair of fine tweezers, and a stern warning: do not touch your face, do not inhale the dust, and wash your hands with lye soap the moment you are finished. You sat at the workbench, the U-case open before you. The foul, cloying smell of the henbane seemed to invade your senses, making your head feel thick and heavy. You carefully broke open the first pod. Using the tweezers, you began the painstaking process of transferring them, one by one, into the bronze bowl. The work was hypnotic, the silence of the shop broken only by the faint tink, tink, tink of the seeds hitting the metal. As you worked, your mind drifted, pulled under by the plant's dark reputation. You thought of the stories of the Benandanti, the good walkers of the northern provinces, who claimed to fall into a deep trance and travel in spirit form to battle witches and protect the harvest. They described sensations of flying, of leaving their physical bodies behind. The learned men at the university dismissed it as peasant superstition, but the apothecaries knew better. They knew the power of plants like henbane to induce such vivid, realistic hallucinations. The flight was not physical, it was a profound, drug-induced delirium. The user's body would be left behind, seemingly dead to the world, catatonic, with a racing heart and dilated pupils, while their mind soared through phantasmagoric landscapes. It was a terrifying power. In the right hands, as Valerius claimed, it could be a tool for a primitive form of psychotherapy, a way to force a confrontation with one's inner demons. But in the wrong hands, it was a one-way ticket to madness, or worse, a tool of the devil. You imagined a lonely woman on the edge of a village, a woman with a knowledge of herbs, being accused of witchcraft. A search of her cottage would reveal a pouch of these seeds. To the Inquisitor, it was not medicine for a troubled mind, it was proof of a pact with Satan. It was the evidence needed to justify the rack, the thumbscrews, and the purifying flames of the stake. And here you were, in the heart of Florence, preparing the very same substance. The line between apothecary and sorcerer had never seemed so thin, so terrifyingly permeable. The air in the room grew heavy, and you could have sworn you saw the shadows in the corners of the shop deepen and writhe, as if brought to life by the plant's malevolent influence. You finished the task, your fingers stiff, your back aching from leaning over the bowl. You had collected a small, dark mound of the potent seeds. Valerius inspected your work, then measured out a minuscule amount, no more than a dozen seeds, and began to grind them with a separate, smaller pestle. He mixed the resulting powder with wine and honey, creating a single dose of what he called a dream cordial. The rest of the seeds were carefully funneled into a small, dark blue vial and returned to the U-case. "A troubled merchant has sent for a remedy for his wife," Valerius explained without looking at you. "She believes her first husband, dead these 5 years, visits her in the night to torment her. This will either grant her the peace to face his spirit or the madness to forget him entirely. The result is in God's hands, not mine." You realized then that to be a master apothecary was not just to know the properties of the plants, but to possess a kind of cold, surgical empathy, to be able to prescribe a potential poison and then absolve oneself of the consequences. Just as Valerius locked the U-case, the bell above the door jingled. A young man entered, dressed in the fine livery of a noble house. He was nervous, his eyes darting around the shadowed shop. You could only catch a few words. "My lady, a ball tonight. She requires the usual." Valerius nodded, a flicker of something. Was it disdain, amusement, passing through his eyes? He turned, not to the iron chest this time, but to a small locked cabinet high on a shelf behind the counter. He retrieved a tiny, elegant vial of clear glass, no bigger than your thumb, filled with a colorless liquid. He wrapped it in a small square of silk and handed it to the servant, who paid with a silver coin and departed as quickly as he had arrived. You watched the exchange, puzzled. Valerius saw your confusion. "You have handled the root that brings the sleep of the dead, and the seeds that bring the sleep of the mad," he said, his voice taking on a didactic tone. "Now you have seen the agent of the sleep of vanity. Inside is the tincture of Atropa belladonna, deadly nightshade." The name was a stark contrast to the scene you had just witnessed. You knew the plant from illustrations, its dull green leaves, its strange bell-shaped purple flowers, and its berries glossy black and deceptively beautiful. They looked like wild cherries, a sweet, fatal temptation for any child who might stumble upon them in the woods. "Belladonna," Valerius continued, a wry smile touching his lips for the first time that day. "It means beautiful woman in the common tongue. The noble ladies of this city, in their endless pursuit of an idealized beauty, use a single drop of this tincture in each eye. It causes the pupil to widen, to dilate into a large, dark pool. It gives them a look of perpetual surprise, of vulnerability, of dark mystery. It is the height of fashion." He paused, letting the irony sink in. "They are, of course, poisoning themselves for the sake of beauty. The tincture blurs their vision. They cannot read, cannot sew, can barely recognize a face from across the room. But they look alluring in the candlelight. A worthy trade, they believe. This, you thought, was the ultimate perversion of the apothecary's art. A deadly poison, a plant that could paralyze a man's heart, being used as a cosmetic. It was a perfect metaphor for the city of Florence itself, a place of breathtaking beauty and art, built upon a foundation of ruthless ambition, political intrigue, and silent, smiling poisoners. Odorless, tasteless, and soluble in wine, its effects were slow and difficult to diagnose. It began with a dry mouth and a racing heart, progressed to delirium and hallucinations, and ended in paralysis and respiratory failure. It looked, to all the world, like a sudden fever, a stroke, a visitation from God. It was the perfect tool for a jealous spouse, a rival for a ducal title, or a cardinal seeking to expedite a papal election. "The same vial that makes a lady's eyes beautiful at the ball," Valerius said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, "could, if poured into her husband's wine, make her a wealthy widow by sunrise." Remember this, boy. All things in nature possess a dual aspect. A thing is not good or evil, it simply is. Its virtue or its vice is determined by the intent of the hand that wields it. The knife that carves the roast can also slit a throat. The fire that warms the hearth can also burn the house down. And the herb that eases pain can also deliver death. Our trade is not in herbs, but in intent. We sell secrets, and we pray they are used wisely. The sun was setting, casting long, distorted shadows across the shop floor. The day's lessons were coming to an end, and you felt as though you had aged a decade since sunrise. Valerius performed one final action. He returned to the iron chest and brought out the last of his treasures. It was not a plant, not a root, not a seed. It was a dark, sticky brick of resin, wrapped in oilcloth and tied with silk cord. As he unwrapped it, a new scent filled the air, one that cut through the foulness of the henbane and the bitterness of the mandrake. It was a sweet, heavy, soporific perfume, a smell of distant lands and forgotten dreams. "Opium," Valerius said, his voice soft, almost reverent. "The milk of the poppy, the tears of the sleeping moon. It comes from the Far East, a long and perilous journey. Of all the substances in this shop, this is the most miraculous and the most perilous. A tincture of opium, in wine laudanum, as the alchemists called it, could stop the most violent cough, quell the most agonizing dysentery, and bring a deep, peaceful, dreamless sleep to those on the brink of death. But its mercy is a siren's song," Valerius warned, his eyes dark. "The sleep it offers is too perfect. The relief it provides is too complete. The body and the soul begin to crave it, to depend upon it. Without it, the world becomes a pale, agonizing shadow. It is a cure that can become a disease far worse than the one it was meant to treat. The Church calls it the devil's milks because it offers a glimpse of paradise without the need for God's grace. It is a false salvation, a blissful cage. Your final task of the day was to scrape a small amount of the resin from the brick." He handed you a silver spatula. The opium was soft and yielding, the texture of cold tar. As you worked, the sweet, cloying scent enveloped you, and you felt a strange sense of peace, a dulling of the sharp edges of your fear and exhaustion. You could understand its temptation. In a world of filth, pain, and constant uncertainty, who would not want to retreat into a perfect, painless dream? You prepared the dose, which was destined for an old man dying of consumption, a final act of kindness to ease his passage from the world. As Valerius sealed the tincture, you looked around the shop, now almost completely dark. The jars on the shelves were just silhouettes. The hanging herbs were dark, skeletal shapes. The shop was no longer just a place of work. It was a library of power, a repository of the fragile boundaries between life and death, sanity and madness, salvation and damnation. Valerius finally dismissed you. You retreated to your small room, the day's smells, the earthy mandrake, the foul henbane, the beautiful poison of belladonna, and the sweet oblivion of opium clinging to your clothes and your skin. You lay down on your straw pallet, but you knew you would not sleep easily. You were no longer just an apprentice. You were a guardian of the secrets, a keeper of the keys to the kingdom of sleep. You had learned that the forbidden sleep herb of the Renaissance was not a single plant. It was the knowledge itself. The terrifying, intoxicating, and damning knowledge of how to manipulate the very essence of consciousness. It was a burden that, once shouldered, could never be set down. As you closed your eyes, you saw not darkness, but a garden of beautiful, whispering poisons, their roots reaching deep into the earth, their flowers nodding in a silent, knowing breeze. And you knew, with a chilling certainty, that you would be tending that garden for the rest of your life.